Async and await are two new keywords being added to JavaScript in ES 2017. They make it much easier to work with functions that return promises. They can be used today in browsers by utilizing Babel, and they are enabled by default in Node version 7.6 and above. Promises represent a value that may be available in the future. A promise can be resolved or rejected. In general, a promise is resolved when things go right and rejected when things go wrong. Here's an example of code that uses promises directly by chaining calls to then and catch. It uses the fetch API, which has methods that return promises. The fetch API is commonly used to make REST calls from client-side web app code. The same technique would apply to any functions that return promises. So in the code we're looking at here, I'm pulling in the node fetch package from npm. That implements the fetch API. Then I have a definition of a function called demo. Down on line 34, you see a call to that. So back to the definition of my function, lines 4 through 6 define some constants that I'll need. The first is the URL prefix I'll use on all of my REST calls. Then we have a name of a user and a name of a store. And my goal here is to make a REST call that retrieves the zip code of the user. Then I want to make a second REST call that retrieves the location of all the Taco Bells in that zip code. So on line 8, I form the URL for the first REST call to get the zip code of that user. On line 9, I'm declaring the variable zip because I need it to be outside the scope of this fetch call. It is used in multiple blocks that are below. Then we have our first REST call on line 10. That call to fetch returns a promise, so I'm chaining a call to then, and when that promise resolves, I'll get the response from the REST call. Then I need to get the body of that response as text. So text is a method that also returns a promise. So I need to chain another call to then. And on line 12, I'll get that zip code. Then I set the value of the variable zip, which is used in several of the code blocks below, print out the zip, and then I can form the URL for my second REST call, which is going to get the locations of the Taco Bells in that zip code. So I make my other call to fetch on line 17 and return that. That's a promise. So I chain another call to then on line 19 where I get the response from that REST call. If I get a status of 404, that means there are no Taco Bells in that zip code. So I throw an error with that message. That will go down to the catch that's on line 31 where I print the message. But if I don't get a 404, then I want to parse the body of the response as JSON, and I will get back an array of descriptions of those locations. And so that happens on line 25, and then I'll print out all of those locations. So let's take a look at this code in action. First, I need to start up my server. I have that set up in my package.json to do that with npm start. So I have now started up my server, and now I'm going to run my client-side app that is using promises, the code that we just looked at. And it finds that the zip code of this user is 63304, and then it prints out my two Taco Bell locations on Mid Rivers Mall Drive and Jungerman Road. So let's take a look now at similar code. This time we're going to use the async and await keywords. Okay, so here is that version. Note how all the calls to functions that return promises in this version are inside a try block, and they're all preceded by the await keyword. And errors from these are all handled in the catch block. And so with this syntax, I get to use the standard try and catch syntax. So we'll see in this version that my demo function is preceded with the async keyword, unlike the previous version, but I'm still calling it down at the bottom, still setting the same three constants, but then my first REST call is going to happen inside this try block. So I begin by setting the URL for this first REST call, and then on line 10, when I make the call to fetch, I precede it with the keyword await. And that's going to cause it to wait for that promise returned by fetch to resolve, and then I get the response. Now I want to get the body of that response as text. So I call text, remember that returns a promise, so I precede that with await, and then I get the zip code, I can print it, and then form the URL for my second call to get the locations of the Taco Bells. So I make my other call to fetch preceded again by the await keyword. I get that response, check to see if it's a 404. If it is, I throw the error. That goes down to the catch on line 25 where I print out that message. Otherwise, I can parse the body of the response as JSON on line 19, once again preceded with the await keyword, and then print out all of those locations. So as you can see, this is not so much about saving lines of code. While it's a little shorter, it's just a few lines shorter. But the big difference is that this code is easier to read. I don't have as many arrow functions involved. In fact, no arrow functions here. And just a lot less syntax to parse through. So the await keyword can be applied to any function call, even ones that do not return promises. This is nice because it allows functions that previously returned a promise to be changed to return ordinary values without breaking existing callers. Here are a few questions that you might have about async and await. What happens if await is used inside a function that is not marked as async? The answer is that you'll get a syntax error. What happens if you call a function marked as async that returns a promise, but you don't use await? In that case, it returns the promise object without waiting for it to resolve or reject, and that's probably not what you intend. What happens if you call a function using await, but the function is not marked as async? It returns its value immediately. What kinds of functions can be marked as async? Well, this works with regular functions and arrow functions, but methods cannot be marked as async. My recommendation is to search your code for calls to then and catch and replace all of them with use of async and await. It will make your code much easier to read. You can find all of the code that we just walked through at the URL on your screen here. That is https://github.com/mvolkmann/async-await-screencast. Thanks for watching.